Can I interest you in an NBA blowout? Because I have a lot of choices from the menu. So, I'm going into last night's games. There was some stuff where I'm like, okay, maybe learn some stuff here. This would be interesting. And then the Bucks are up 75-38 in the Celtics at the half. Apparently, and this was TNT's number, that deficit for Boston was their worst first half deficit since 1967. So I know that I resist a lot of the back-to-back stuff because I just get so sick of hearing about like a team loses and you go, oh, well, it was back-to-back to back-to-back, and you're like, okay, as if no team has ever lost or ever won a back-to-back, right? So I think that there's a really good Milwaukee part of it where you go, okay, how many teams could have done that to Boston in the NBA, even with the back-to-back stuff with Minnesota in overtime the night before? Like, that's a really short list. And for Milwaukee, who, despite the really good record in the seed, they are in that group of a team that we have expectations to be like, can this team win a title? But then we look at the rotations, we look at the defense, and there's stuff with Milwaukee. You're like, man, I don't like that number, or that's a little weird, or what's going on there? Although I would say Middleton, who on the perimeter didn't look great in the first matchup against Boston, I thought he just looks better. He looks better physically. I thought he was holding up in some of the possessions that actually still mattered before this game was an 18-point blowout in the first quarter. I would look at Jackson and MarJon as real rotational pieces that are just different players in a good way, so that maybe Milwaukee has a little bit more there. But, when the first line of defense goes from Drew Holiday to Dame Lillard, your defensive numbers are going to struggle. But maybe the way this game is played now, it might not really matter if you're that horrified with the Lillard-Giannis matchup on one side and the way both can kind of initiate the offense. So there's a positive there, even if there's a lot of people that want to look at the result and just be so dismissive of it. And of course, if you go back to not even a year ago, when you had a regular season matchup with Boston last year, they played 3 games. Boston won 2 of the 3. It was a win by Boston with no Middleton in the first one. It was the overtime win by Milwaukee when Boston was playing Blake Griffin, Hauser, Muscala, Derek White, and Grant as the starters. And you're like, what's going on here? Like, why did this? But it's kind of the Doc Rivers rule, right? Where Doc Rivers has always said, I'd rather have everybody play than nobody play because your team will just kind of mail it in. So then you had the last regular season matchup where Boston destroys them on March 30th, 140-89. But Milwaukee was coming off of a back-to-back where they did travel, a 149-136 win against the Pacers. It was 5 in 7 nights, just like Boston last night was 5 games in 7 nights on the back-to-back on a travel there. If you want to go the Boston side of it, you're like, okay, yeah, but in the back-to-back on March 30th of last year, Giannis, Lopez, and Drew played 32, 31, and 32 minutes. And then the Boston guys in overtime against Minnesota on Wednesday, Tatum played 42, Brown 43, White 43, Drew 40 minutes. Look, you can't completely dismiss it from the 5 and 7 nights, but I don't really want to do that. I think the result is real in the sense that it's okay, Milwaukee has something to point to. Milwaukee has a bit of their own wake-up call, while I don't wake up this morning or look at those games last night thinking simultaneously like, oh no, what's wrong with Boston? I think we all know what's wrong with Boston if it doesn't work out for them. Some of those late possessions, I've dug in some of the isolation things. Are there too many times where they settle? Do they not play as connected as you'd want them to? But then I watch Minnesota's offense with another, campaign as a title contending team and look at their offense late and go, okay, hard double teams on Anthony Edwards, couple turnovers there late. Like, what are they doing to unlock their offense? So I think it can be both things. It is not a write-off of Boston getting smashed like that, but a reminder of maybe what Milwaukee is capable of. But there's a bigger thing going on, and that is just the blowouts in general. I have a bunch of numbers for you, so you're going to have to bear with me to get to the end of this, because I also reached out to a bunch of different NBA sources last night, just whether it was front office, coaching staff guys, where I go, okay, look, it feels like the eye test is telling us now we're having more blowouts than ever. Do you have any theories? And so I've got a bunch of quotes that I'm going to read from guys that I was texting with last night, because last night got really ugly. I mean, Oklahoma City beat Portland. The final score in that one was 139-77, which ties for the 5th largest margin of victory. Then you had Phoenix and LA. I mean, granted, that's not historically, but it's like, okay, so if we're all watching these games every single night and we're seeing these scores, like, is there something that actually is going on that's a little bit different? So before we get to the theories that are sourced, let's get through where we're at offensively. The top 8 offensive ratings in league history are all the last 8 seasons, okay? Offensive rating is points per 100 possessions. 3 years ago, it was 112. This year, it is an all-time record of 115.7 points per 100 possessions. For context, the best Suns team during the 7 seconds or less run, their best offensive rating was 110.2, which would be the 26th best offense in today's NBA. Let's look at pace, which is an estimate of possessions per 48 minutes. It's always a little weird because it peaked in the 70s, but it didn't start tracking until 73, 74. If you watch old films prior to that, going back even further, it was just absurd the way they played. They dribbled it up, they shot, and they didn't make it. And they just kept doing it over and over again. So the pace is even higher then. But pace has been around this 100 number about the last 6 years, which is a significant jump from about 10 years ago, where the pace averaged about 90 possessions per 48 minutes. 23-24 is the 14th best field goal percentage league-wide. So this year, if you look at the shooting numbers, this is the 14th best shooting percentage season we have had, tracking like 72 years of it, maybe 74 years of it, okay? It's about the same number as last year. The other top 12, so if you go, say, last year and this year are 13 and 14, the top 12 shooting seasons all time in NBA history are all the 70s or 80s, with one of those 80 seasons being an 89-90 year. So, okay, the shooting is better historically this year. Like, that's a pretty big number if all the other years were 40 to 30 years ago. But you're telling me that with more three-point attempts, that this season has a really good field goal percentage number, because if we look at the three-point attempts league-wide per team, the league is basically peaked around 35 three-point attempts per game per team over the course of a season. It's flattened a bit, but that's kind of where we've been the last couple of years. So now you're taking a more difficult shot that traditionally is a lower percentage, about 36% from three league-wide, and you're telling me that in this year and last year, you have a much better overall field goal percentage historically. Like, that tells you that the shot making is just that much better, which I think all of us would agree. The eye test tells us there's more players on the floor that can make more and more difficult shots as the evolution of the game is getting better and better. So for the 23-24 season to have the 12th best field goal percentage season, 12th or 13th, with 70 three-point attempts per game, this is real, right? The shot-making part of this is real. I have one more thought on free throws, because I believe the free throw problem is real, but there's really not any numbers that tell me that it's as much of a problem as I think it is when I'm sitting at home on the couch. The numbers don't back up what I think is a free throw issue. The free throw attempts per game for 23-24 is 72nd all time. There's a lot more free throw data if you look back at it historically. But if you look at having more threes, that's, of course, going to equal less attempts to be fouled on. I think that's pretty easy to understand. The other part of it is I go, well, maybe it's that the high usage players are getting more free throw attempts. So because we have more high usage players, it just means more free throw attempts. It doesn't mean necessarily players are getting more calls. It just means, well, no, they're getting more calls because they have the ball more and more. And I think what happened about 6 or 7 years ago is some of the smarter analytic teams just looked at it and said, well, look, if this certain player has the ball and this is what he scores points per possession, why are we having him have the ball less? I just think there's a separation between that being something you can work and bank on in the playoffs versus it being a lot easier in the regular season. So my free throw theories, it's hard to find a number where I feel like it backs up what I'm seeing. And I've read a lot of stuff that tells you this actually isn't any different. And there's other seasons where the free throw rates were way beyond what we're seeing now. If you go back 20 years ago, and I had this line where it was like, how many players are taking 7 free throw attempts or more per game? 20 years ago, it was 8. 10 years ago, it was 9. This year, it's 16. That doesn't really mean all that much. It could just be personally for me, it could be the handful of players that just piss me off every night with the way they're officiated, which makes me think that free throw rate for those players is still kind of absurd. Watching the Atlanta Philly overtime game and how that played out, where Trae Young drove into Tyrese Maxey and got the call and fouled Maxey out, a call I just don't think should exist, where the offensive player initiates all of that contact and we just give him the foul every single time. I didn't have much sympathy for Sixers fans, specifically on Maxey in that play, because it's the same fucking thing that he does all the time. Trae right now, who is now the headliner, now that Harden just doesn't take as many free throws, Trae is the headliner, the poster boy for this. As great as he is, probably the best lob threat in the entire league. He's fascinating. He's incredibly talented. Ice water in his veins in playoff moments. I'll sign up for all of it. But the free throw part of it, he's going to very quickly here, for players who played in 400 games, he will average 7.8 free throw attempts per game, which is going to be 21st all time. Kobe was at 7.4. Jordan was at 8.2. Embiid, by the way, is third all time with 10 free throw attempts per game behind Wilt and another old timer. So it may be more about what I'm seeing and what I don't like with a very small select group of players, even if I just feel like there's some nights where you just get a whistle where it's like you're giving the offensive player literally everything. So now that I've given you the kind of an update of where we're at offensively, it's okay. So what does that mean about the actual blowouts? So let's go through some source stuff here. Here's one advanced scout. His quote, I think you're seeing more effort game to game, and if you don't bring it every night right now, it shows and you get blown out. Sounds simple, but that's what I see. Also, coaches seem quick to go to subs, deep bench when they get down, say 20, which normally doesn't happen. Some coaches even go with bench guys to start second half, which rarely used to happen. We saw that last night with Boston. Here's a coach. I asked him, why so many blowouts? His theory, quote, X and O's wise, I think it's all tied to the offense this season. Teams are in rhythm and making shots at an all-time high. I've seen bad shooting teams have hot nights, and they're able to score 120, 130. Overall, I think as tight as the standings are, teams are hitting the dog days of the season, and during this time of year, there's usually inconsistency. Trade rumors and coaching change narratives are starting to swirl. Connectivity is being tested, and because tensions are at an all-time high during this time of year, teams are either pressing or relaxing, which creates inconsistency. Teams seem to be riding the roller coaster. Okay, good stuff there. This is another scout with a front office. His quote, my two theories are, one, teams players know they need to play a certain amount of games now, so the corpses come out and take the tip, and once the game remotely starts getting away, it's easy excuse to give guys a night off without actually doing so. Second theory, talent gap between haves and have-nots is greater than it's been in years, so bad teams are going to look even worse. That second part may be becoming true here. Like when I look at Portland, I see a couple guys in their rotation that are playing that I don't think would play in the Pistons rotation. The Pistons record is abysmal. I still think that team sweeps the hinky Sixers. Neither team would be in the playoffs. I think I don't know that we have more bad teams. I think we have still some more talented stuff, but clearly the offensive theories or the first part of that quote being like, we may just see people waving the white flag more than we've ever seen it before, but it's harder to find the data that totally backs that up. Here's another front office member, okay? His quote, as three-point volume, the biggest one, pace scoring increased league-wide, the way it's, as some of this is actually pretty predictable. Inevitably, there will be nights where some teams make a bunch of shots and some teams miss a bunch of shots, and on a night when both things could happen, it could lead to pretty catastrophic score outcomes. Quote, shooting luck is the worst thing you can say to explain a game because it's so ambiguous, but it's more of a driver of results than people realize. All teams have some sort of given the shots taken that was supposed to happen. Again, shot quality, how well did you'll hear it. Your coach, your favorite team's like, hey, we like the looks tonight. And I know you never want to hear it, but that's exactly what this guy's saying. His quote continues. Everybody has that in the post-game model, and I bet a lot of these blowouts were expected to be closer than they were. It's harder to have crazy blowouts when every game is 101 to 90. The sheer scoring volume by teams is going to lead to crazy lopsided outcomes. So that's the reason I went through all that offensive stuff, because that's that quote connects to what I was talking about. When you have some of the best shooting seasons with a 3-point run and a jump from pace pretty significantly from 10 years ago, that when you're adding that all together, you're like, when it gets real sideways in some of these games, that might be why we're seeing more blowouts. Here's a coach, because I really like this, and then I'll read one more after this. His quote: "Personally, I think it's a combo of pace, threes, pro offensive officiating, and how most teams are built. 2 to 3 offensive focal points with non-scoring role players around him. When a guy is hurt or doesn't have it going, teams can have a really hard time scoring. The travel this year has been worse than usual because of the in-season tournament. Offensive rating is also an all-time high, so guessing that leads to higher probability of catching some extreme hot streaks from teams." So he mentioned the in-season tournament, which I'm not going to read every single quote that I got last night because some of it doubles up. The off-season tournament was pointed to a few times. And one of my rules is what? Like, when something's different, that becomes the excuse of why we think we're seeing the things that we're seeing. So if you look at some of the numbers that we have, all right, and we look this up, we're seeing from the first in-season tournament Friday, there was a 10-year record on number of close games from the start of the season to that point. But now looking at that as a line in the sand after the in-season tournament, there's been a 5% uptick year over year on 20-point-plus games, which is about 20 to 25 additional blowouts over the course of the season so far compared to last season. So not 20 to 25 total over the course of the season, 20 to 25 more blowouts than where we were at this time of the season in comparison to last year. So that is a real thing. What we are seeing, I believe, with that number is backing it up. But there's also a very important part to add to that. Does that mean that's what we're going to see now for the rest of the season? Or are we just in this really weird stretch of 60 plus days where certain nights you're throwing it on and you're going, what the hell happened to the league pass that I thought I knew? There's just not enough data here to say that this is what it is and what it'll be moving forward. I just thought that was really interesting to share a lot of that stuff. But I think the main thing we could all agree on is the offense having never been better than it is right now, leading to just games where it gets absurd because the shot making is the best we've ever seen.